Hello everybody, welcome back to Hot Seat with Tenzola. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are tuning in for the first time, welcome to my channel. Today I have the pleasure of having a chat with Busisiwe Avuso, the CEO of Business Leadership of South Africa. Busi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you
You're
for
on the hot seat
inviting me.
today.
I am. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So before we go into the juicy parts, I have lots of questions for you. But I mean, I'm going to try and cut them short because we don't have the whole day.
Yeah.
But before we start with the questions, tell me about the role that you play in the corporate space and what the objective of your organization is.
So Business Leadership South Africa is the only organization of CEOs in the country. And we mainly represent big business. Okay. And our objective is to ensure that the environment within which business operates is a conducive environment. And what that means, it means that for business to invest in the country, there are particular reforms that have to happen from a policy perspective. So ours, therefore, is to ensure that there's engagement with government and with all the social partners to attain and to achieve, that conducive environment to enable the investment flow into the country.
Just to clarify, when you say business, we are talking about the private sector and different organizations within that. Okay.
Absolutely.
Cool. And I mean, that sounds great. It sounds like a great plan. How are you doing so far in the objective of in that objective in particular?
Yeah.
How practical is it? Are we going to get there? Do we see the light at the end of the tunnel? Is there collaboration amongst the stakeholders that are involved?
Are we going to get there? Hopefully so. Unfortunately, when you look at the metrics in the country, it's not pointing in the right direction. We know that our economy is sitting at its weakest. We know that the COVID-19 crisis has actually exacerbated the problems from an economic perspective that we are facing. We know that we're sitting with unemployment of 31% in terms of the expanded definition, where you sit in, or rather narrow definition, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. Now, it doesn't matter which way you choose to look at it, it is a recipe for disaster. So if we're talking about structural reform and if we're talking about policy reform, let's agree that there are urgent interventions that need to be put in place to ensure that business can invest, because if business invests, then you get economic growth, and if you get economic growth, then you start dealing with the unemployment crisis that we're facing. So there is collaboration, there is engagement between the social partners, but I think with everything else in the South African context, we are currently sitting in an environment where there is lethargy in implementation. We are known as a country of great plans, but we fail dismally when it comes to implementation. And unfortunately, in terms of where we are at the moment, we are facing that same crisis.
So I mean, you've answered the one of the questions that I was going to ask around COVID and its global impact, and obviously the unemployment. And you've also spoken about how the collaboration exists amongst the stakeholders.
Yeah.
What role does the ordinary South African citizen plays? Because I assume that we are all stakeholders, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what role do we play as an ordinary South African? And can we actually play a role? How do we contribute to this objective of your organization in ensuring that we get to at least get as close as possible to the objective?
So when you're talking about an ordinary South African, you're talking about civil society broadly.
Yeah.
And I think there is a very critical role that civil society, I guess, needs to play in terms of ensuring that we achieve the objectives that we need to achieve as a country. Maybe let me take the example of unemployment and say, what does that mean on a practical level? And how do we ensure, that we start seeing lesser numbers in as far as unemployment is concerned? So if you look at unemployment, for instance, it is a fallacy to think that we can deal with unemployment without having economic growth. And let's probably look at what does economic growth mean and how do you attain it. So economic growth is a function of the economic activity that happens in the economy. And when you go back to Economics 101, it is spiraled by you and I having disposable income, leaving our houses, going to buy goods and services. And the more we spend, demand increases. And if demand increases, then supply has to increase. And if business has to increase supply, then they hire more people. And if they are hiring more people, unemployment decreases. And if unemployment decreases, then there is less dependence on the fiscus, which means that which governments need to take care of. Because if you're unemployed, then there's a lot of people that are actually dependent on some form of social grant, right?
Social grant,
or the other, exactly. I think the number in the country at the moment is we have 18 million people dependent on social grants and only 7 million people earning enough to pay as you earn. So it doesn't matter which way you choose to look at it, it is a recipe for disaster. What we ought to be driving for as a country is how do we actually switch these around, have more people working and paying
tax, and then
paying
less people
taxes,
dependent on the public system.
and less people dependent on the public system, as it were. So that is how economic growth is set off, as it were. So what is it? It is a function of consumer spending, it is a function of investment spending, and it is a function of government spending. Investment spending is businesses investing in the country, and simplistically building more factories to hire more people. I think we know for 3 or 2 years now that President Cyril Ramaphosa has been in office, he's been talking about trying to get foreign direct investment in the country. Because by getting investment in the country, then when they set up businesses, they need to hire people. And in hiring people, then unemployment decreases.
Hiring more people from the country.
And of course, if they are going to set up their operations here, then it means that hiring more people from the country. So consumer spending has to increase, investment spending has to increase, and government spending has to increase. Government spending is a function of the taxes that you and I pay. So it's pay as you earn that we contribute from our salaries. It's the corporate tax that businesses pay. It's the VAT that we pay when we buy goods and services, and that is the pot of money that is available to government to can build schools, build roads, and. So that is how you deal with unemployment in a country. So it is a function of economic growth. So if you were to look at, is it plausible or even possible to deal with this notion of unemployment without focusing on economic growth, then the answer is no, it is not. So how do you actually therefore spare investment spending? You do so by ensuring that the environment, and this is where I started, Penny, that Business Leadership South Africa exists to ensure that the environment within which business operates is a conducive environment. So you can forget about trying to get investors to bring their money in the country if the environment within which they're operating is not conducive. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about policy. Business has been talking about policy clarity and policy certainty for the longest time. We, for instance, know that there is an issue around land reform, that is yet to be settled, right? We know that Section 25 of the Constitution ought to be amended, but until we know what that amendment means, until we know that in amending Section 25, property rights are going to be protected, you can forget about investment wherever in the world, bringing their money in the country.
Before I forget, I want to touch on that point quickly to say, whilst we are waiting and the decisions have not been, what is the impact of that?
Absolutely. So the impact of that is that investment is cancelled, investment is redirected, investment is suspended, and that is the situation that we're sitting in. I think you would remember that during this lockdown period, when the president unilaterally decided to announce the shutting down of the alcohol industry without consultation and shutting it down indefinitely, we saw, and I hope I'm going to get these figures right, was it AB InBev suspending or cancelling investment of, was it 12 billion rands? So that is money that they had already earmarked to spend in South Africa. But now, all of a sudden, their operations are disrupted. Government, without consulting industry, decides that we're going to shut you down, and we don't know when we're going to reopen the industry. So no organization wants to sit with money in the bank. Money is right. Exactly. Money is there so that it can earn, IRR. And if it earns IRR, you can only earn the return on investment by investing. So they therefore
hang there and chill, right?
And that is the biggest issue that we're facing in the country, in as far as our economy is concerned.
I mean, it's a disastrous situation that we find ourselves in, and with this pandemic here, COVID-19. Now, how practical is it? You spoke. I mean, you gave us a clear circle or an interdependent process around unemployment, around economy, and I'm assuming it's not only unemployment, but with growth and unemployment and unemployment decreasing comes other things. You know, there's public system with the pressure is alleviated. And then perhaps we have more money to budget for schools. Education is now impacted. So there's a whole chain involved. But how practical is it for us to recover from where we are at this point? And maybe you won't be able to answer the question around practicality, but I find that in the textbook it sounds great. This is what we need to be doing. And I hear when you say, as an ordinary South African, this is how I contribute. It makes perfect sense from a tax perspective. But if 80 million people are waiting every month for my tax, for our tax payment, there's obviously a deficit from a tax collection perspective. How do we deal with that? That deficit, because it's month on month, right? And South Africa also is known for service delivery protests, demand, without understanding where the resources come from. For instance, we remember the fees must fall. The concept was great. We understand there's a lot of previously disadvantaged kids that actually can't afford university, and therefore whatever system, whatever government spending that is there, to a certain degree perhaps must cover or must account for that, where the privileged must pay for the school fees. But when it comes to things like electricity and water, we know the disaster situation that we find ourselves in terms of load shedding and stuff. But how do we then, is it practical for Telkom, for Eskom to give free electricity? In your opinion,
So in the current context and in the current environment, no. I think we know that the biggest albatross that we have around our necks as a country is the risk that Eskom poses. I think from an exposure perspective, we are sitting with about 670 billion rands exposure. Now, let me backtrack. You are rightfully talking about the social instability that we have in the country and how that contributes to attaining a conducive environment or not. But you probably have to go back and say, what is it that we have done as a country from a structural perspective to try and level the playing field? And when I'm talking about level the playing field, I'm talking about the fact that we are a 26-year democracy where you had, or we inherited an environment where the majority of the citizens of this country were excluded from participating in the economic mainstream. And how do you include more people in the economic mainstream? You include them by making sure that policy is conducive for most people to be included. So policies such as employment equity and triple BE, as inadequate as they may be, are precisely designed to achieve that. And if you ask me, the problem that we have in this country is that we have failed to deal with the structural inequities of this country. So you're sitting in a country with a pyramid structure where you have 10% of the population that is opulent, 40% of the population that is the middle class, and 50% of people living in abject poverty. Now, it doesn't matter which way you choose to look at it. You are never going to get social stability without addressing domestic equality. And I think for me, the biggest failures of this ANC-led government is precisely that. When the National Party government took over in 1948, they were very clear what the problem statement was. they came in and they said, we want to deal with the poor Afrikaner problem. Because remember, prior to 1948, it was the English regime that was in power. The Afrikaners came in 1948. They were very clear that we want to deal with the poor Afrikaner problem.
And they dealt with that.
And they dealt with it, right? If you wanted to be a farmer, they will give you huge subsidies, They will give you land, you know, at no cost. If you wanted to be employed, I mean, they set up Transnet, Eskom, the PRASA, and whatever these SOEs to ensure that Afrikaners have employment, right? And all these Department of Home Affairs and whatever. So they were dealt with, you know, they were taken care of. And how government did it, they ensured that they enact policy that is going to favor the Afrikaner community. The reason why you have the Stellenbosch Mafia in this country today is precisely because the National Party government made it possible that the Afrikaner community should be taken care of. So that was a clear problem statement that they wanted to solve for. They even put in place more than 107 pieces of legislation to exclude the black people from participating in the economic mainstream, right? From telling you where to live, what you can study,
what jobs
you know,
can get.
right? You know, math and science for a black kid is, you know,
not a thing,
right? And so they were very, very systematic, right? And they were very clear what they wanted to achieve. So my question, when we fast forward 26 years into democracy, is what is it from a policy perspective have we done as this ANC-led government to level the playing field? What is it that we've done? You know, this is tantamount to taking two people and you're saying you are going to have to start a race and you are competing. But you are failing to realize that the one is exactly. The other one is already a kilometer ahead. So I cannot be expected to compete.
To actually even win, or maybe even at the same level.
So
now, but before you go on, and I know I'm going to forget this question, you explained it so well that the previous government made sure that the certain type of people were looked after from a policy perspective and everything was sorted. Now, and it also seems that the collaboration at the time with private sector was aligned because even in the private sector, those particular individuals were taken care of. Now, I'm failing to see that today, that, you know, tables have turned, we've now taken over, you know, a new government is in, you know, I do see policies like, you know, the employment equity, and it's there, and we are seen to be applying it. But when you look at the numbers, you know, month on month, from an executive level, you know, middle management level, those numbers are not shifting.
Exactly.
So it seems that that's not even working. Even the private sector is not aligned. You know, I'm not able to see that after 26 years. You know, we can shift it. You know, we've had 26 years to shift it.
Absolutely.
Why are we failing with the implementation? You know, I must say that I used to work for one organization where when I was in the HR space, and people were saying, no, but guys, we need to drive these numbers because we have to present these numbers to Parliament or what and whatever. And we were working towards these numbers, but the numbers they're not happening. They're not reaching our targets. And once the HR policy is clear within the private sector, within the organization, that this role is, you know, as per the EE, you know, policy, but we're not getting there. So from where I'm sitting, I'm truly not confident, and I'm not sure what would drive me as an ordinary South African to continue to want to contribute in changing this and driving it into a different direction. I don't know what your opinion is on that.
I absolutely agree with you, and I share your sentiments. From where I'm sitting, I'm also not confident. You see, this is a function of political will. So it is one thing to enact policy, but if you are not going to implement monitoring and evaluation to ensure that that policy which has been enacted
there's no
is absorbed.
QA management process, then how do you...
And that is exactly where we are sitting. You know, you've got these policies which don't have teeth. You know, the private sector is continuously not observing, employment equity and triple P legislation, we're sitting in a country where, it seems as if the private sector that I lead, by the way, have to be begged to do the right thing. As if they don't understand that if we don't contribute to the socio-economic transformation, then it leads to the social instability. Because, look, let's be clear. While the poor won't eat, then we as the rich are not going to sleep. Or rather, while the have-nots don't eat, then the haves are not going to eat. So in my mind, it is just as clear as that it is manifestly within our interests as the private sector to say, how do we work towards attaining domestic equality? Because if you have domestic inequality, you've got social stability. And if you have social stability, then you as business have a conducive environment within which you're operating. Then you as business don't have to deal with Alexander crossing the M1 bridge and shutting the richest square mile in Africa down, because then that is the language that they use to show their frustration and to say enough and no more, And I think if you look at the pyramid structure that I spoke about, if you only have 10% of the population opulent and 50% living in abject poverty, let's agree that these that don't have are way too many. If they were to decide to get today, all angry at once, they will literally shut this country and this economy down. So what therefore becomes the role of the private sector? What becomes the role of government? What becomes the role of labor, as it were? So government therefore is sitting with the key to can actually say, private sector, you are going to do this, conform, or else. But the problem in this country is that there isn't an or else. Even though we do talk about the or else, but implementation, is not forthcoming, right? So I don't think that the people who talk about business as white monopoly capital are wrong. They are not. Because when you look at, just break down the word white monopoly capital, it means that capital in this country continues to reside in the hands of the minority. White people in this country are only 9%, 10%. So to have 9% of the population commanding 95% of the wealth is a recipe for disaster. We have just overtaken Brazil as the most unequal society in the world. When you look at the income distribution in the country, for instance, in line with our pyramid structure, the 10% earns 58% of the population. The 40% middle class earns 35% of the population. And the 50%, which is the 30 million people who are living in abject poverty, the South African population is 59 million. So to have more than half of your population living in abject poverty, and you sit and you do nothing about it as government, you don't see this as a crisis, you are not spared to action, for me, it is mind-boggling. I look at it and I say, does government in this country understand its role? Do they understand that theirs is to ensure that they attain or contribute to achieving this, conducive environment? And I think the answer is no. This ANC-led government does not understand its role. Far from it, they don't.
So yes, I hear that our current government is obviously not understanding quite a few things around in terms of how we need to move on. But this is the same government we've put in power. So what is our role in shifting that? Because we play a big role there, right? So we've put these guys in power for 26 years. And we keep saying, and I see a lot on social media now, people are tired, this, that. But, because just before elections, the people are aware that other people are living in poverty. There's food parcels. There's all these things that we are aware. We are working on a plan that's going to do this for you and whatever. But obviously after the elections, that plan is non-existent. But so I almost feel like we're in an abusive relationship, right? So the person comes and says, I'm sorry, I did this because this, that, but from now on, here's a gift, and then let's get back together. We get back together, then we do the same thing to me. So what role do we as South Africans play in choosing the right people? And do we even have the right people in this country to choose?
Sure.
I mean, that's really.
So,
I mean, that's really what I don't know what your opinion is on that.
You're raising a very critical point, Penny, and you asked the question earlier on around what is the role of a Joe Public? What is
Yes.
the role of an ordinary South African on the
Yes.
street, right? So I think if we were to understand the power that we command as civil society, because we are the electorate, and we put these people into power. There is a saying, I'm not sure by who, which says the role of the oppression that exists is determined by not the oppressor, but the oppressed. So as the oppressed, you've got the power to say, how long am I going to live under this oppression? And I don't know if we realize that. I don't know if we realize that we can actually, the same way that we have put this government in power and we are not happy for 26 years in terms of their delivery or lack thereof, we therefore have an instrument, that we can use by exercising our voting power, right? When we go to, I don't know, come national elections, I think there's municipal elections that are coming up next year, by actually removing this ANC-led government, if we think that they are doing very little to actually serve, the country. And it is unfortunate because you're sitting in an environment where a lot of people will tell you that maybe, just maybe, things were better under the apartheid regime. And I look at it as a leader myself, I say it is a huge indictment, for our people, where you have government that is black-led, business that to a certain extent is black-led, and they look at you and they are saying that we don't have confidence in what you are doing. We don't think that you understand the abject poverty and the adversity that we are subjected to on a day-to-day basis, such that we would rather have the apartheid. I mean, no person in their right mind, that person is going to have to be very desperate to say that I'd want to go back to the apartheid regime, because that was a very, I mean, from a human rights perspective, let's not go there. But then the electorate, therefore, and the civil society have got that power, to can actually put people in place or in power that can actually deliver that which they want to deliver. Do we have an alternative in South Africa in as far as from an ANC perspective? I don't know. It is a function of, do we understand what the different manifestos, of the DA and of the EFF and of the UDM and are? What are they promising?
Or
how
are we even staying in this relationship because we don't want to vote for, obviously DA, some they consider it to be, a
white-led still.
So are we now stuck in this abusive relationship because we don't have an alternative that seems to be better? Whilst we know that we are being abused, we're going to stay because we just don't want to give it to this other person.
Absolutely.
But what are the opportunities for? I mean, I've seen a lot of parties come up and they just fail. There was COPE, there was another one. I think it was led by this black woman. I just forgot her name.
Yes, Mampela.
Yeah. And that kind of it failed. And so as South Africa, as ordinary South Africans, you over and over feel failed again, and you'd rather just stick to this monster that the monster and I think for me, the reason I'm asking, we're probably not going to find the answer in this conversation, but I'm asking this because these are real questions that will probably give us direction in terms of where we need to move to, because otherwise we're just going around and round and round. And I think your organization does play a critical role, and I'm just not sure, if your organization can do this alone.
Yeah. So civil society has got a very powerful role to play in terms of how they choose their political leaders. And I think for me, this is a function of what makes a leader, and what is it that we look for when we appoint a person into power. And I think this is where politics is coming in, probably maybe fundamentally short, as it were. Not affiliated to any political party, so I don't know what happens in these branches, as it were. But I'd like to think, when I look at the caliber of our leaders, I'm led to believe that I just have to go to that branch meeting and have the biggest and the loudest voice and talk a whole lot of words, English words, string them together, and I'm sure in that way you are therefore put in power, as it were. But I think when you look at what are the fundamentals and the characteristics that you want to have in a leader? So for me, leadership is about three things and three things only. Leadership is about having a compelling vision. It is about integrity, and it is about courage. And I think let's agree that when you look at how our country and the scourge that we are facing around corruption, let's agree that ethical leadership, does not exist. So how do we ensure that we don't make the same mistake again? How do we ensure, as you put it, that we don't find ourselves in this abusive relationship? So I think there is a lot that we have to do in terms of how do we choose our leaders. But to a large extent, maybe we're sitting with a flawed political system, where you vote for a party versus voting for an individual, right? Yeah. Because I guess you can probably maybe ask the individual the right...
You can hold the individual accountable.
Yeah. And you can ask them the right questions, yes. You can look at their credentials, you can look at their history, you can look at... So we don't have...
Or maybe even adopt, the process of the debate system like in other countries.
Like in the US, as it is currently. Yes. So we don't have that independent electoral system. You vote for a party and the party gives you a...
The party gives you anyone.
Right? Yeah, they give you a Jacob Zuma, and he therefore comes in, and 10 years later, the country is... Exactly. 10 years later, you have the state capture project and the country's gains, that we have attained over the past, 15 years are reversed.
And obviously the loss of strategic assets as well in the process.
Absolutely, because then people who have self-respect, who know why they were in government in the first place, who understand that government is about servant leadership, then, there is no way that they will allow themselves, to serve under Jacob Zuma, as it were. So you therefore lose a whole lot of institutional memory, but you lose a lot of people, with the right qualities, with the right moral compass, like we have seen in the country. And I think we are well on our way to being another failed African state because we have failed to put the right leaders in power.
Sure. I want to move away a bit from the government. I want to come back to your organization. There's two questions that I have for you. One, what's your organization's contribution in the pay disparity amongst gender, amongst race? And I speak as a corporate person. I've seen it. When we advertise roles, the roles have budgets. But if the role is given to a black person, there's all of a sudden a checklist of, do they have a degree or do they have this? There's a much more much more focus on the person. As to why they don't deserve the budgeted amount. Versus when it's another race where they are deemed competent until they actually mess up. And I know for sure, I don't have the stats, but when I did an episode on discrimination against women in the workplace, and there was I think about a 70% of men, there's a 70% difference between what men get paid and women in the same role. So and what are we doing about that? Is your organization, even talking about such things? What would be your contribution around that particular subject?
And that is a very important question. And I think when you look at who the biggest culprits are, in terms of perpetuating issues of gender disparity and race disparity, it is precisely big business, the JSE listed companies that I lead. But then you probably maybe go back, Penny, and say, why is that so? Who is making sure that business and big business in particular does what they're supposed to do, and it still goes back to, there is a void in monitoring and evaluation and in ensuring that whatever it is that we enact, because it is not a policy of this country,
sure that
right?
it actually happens.
It is the monitoring and evaluation. So that is one thing. But I think the second thing is, I don't know if we should be having a business constituency and a business community that needs to be monitored, to that nth degree. I think I'd like to think that we're going to have to take it upon ourselves as business to do the right thing. And the Department of Labor, year after year, issues the Commission of Employment Equity report. And I think the one that they issued this year is their 20th or the 22nd or whatever the case is. And it still shows dismal numbers, to your point. When you look at the executive positions in the private sector and in big businesses, you will see that white males continue to hold 70% of leadership positions, and I think women, I don't know, we are sitting somewhere in the 23%. I'm not talking about black women, I'm just talking about women
general. I mean,
right?
If you drill that
down to black African women, you're talking about 4%.
Yes,
And you look at it and you say, where is policy here? Because it is a huge anomaly that in a country where black Africans are 80% of the population, in a country where the stats tell us year after year that there is more black African women entering universities, there is more of us graduating, there is more of us, right?
It's
so
not making sense.
it doesn't make sense. So there is more of us being absorbed into corporate South Africa. So let's agree that there is something to be said about the environment within corporate South Africa that is not conducive for the acceleration of black African women into leadership positions. And, where is that conversation being held? Nowhere. And who's, exactly.
We are having it now, but I mean...
at the levels where,
at the level where it should be happening, I mean, it's probably not happening.
It is not happening, and the issue of gender pay parity is another issue. The law in this country says that, for equal pay for work of equal value. So you and I'm a white man, you are a black African woman, we're doing the same work. We're going to have to be paid the same, but you're sitting in an environment where women continue being paid 73% of what men are being paid. This is unfortunately not just a South African phenomena, it is an international phenomena. It is a function of the patriarchal system that we have in this country. It is a function of, I don't know to what extent we shine enough spotlight on the gender agenda, not just in the country but in the world. It is a function of political will, and this is where, when you're talking about what is the role of policy in a country? The role of policy is to precisely level the playing field. When you go to Norway, they were very deliberate and intentional about their gender agenda. They enacted a policy that said, for the next however many years, because if you're driving something, you're going to have to be able to measure it, right? So you're going to have to say, this is what I want to achieve by when. So they were very clear that we want to achieve 40% women representation by this time, in the top echelons of corporate Norway. And they made it law, for companies to actually, accelerate the ascension of women into corporate positions.
Did the same thing.
I think I said, so there is a lot of examples that but when you look at how those countries got it right, you will see that it is a function of political will. But when you look at where are we in as far as political will is concerned, in this country, political will is nowhere. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually not trying to derail the conversation from the responsibility that we as business have to do the right thing. I'm saying we ought to do the right thing, but in an environment where for 26 years, in an environment where for 26 years we have failed to do the right thing, why is policy not coming in to autocorrect, or to make sure that they correct the situation? And again, this goes back to, the social instability. And this is why you have social instability. This is why you have people saying free education. This is why you have people, Alexander, right? Free electricity, free, because they are saying, the system is not working. Government is not doing enough, to ensure that the system works the way it's supposed to work. 26 years into democracy, we're sitting with the disparities that we're sitting with, with people, who are poorer than what they were in 1994, and you have to look and say, to what extent, is this environment and is this system serving me? And in all honesty, people are poorer today than what they were in 1994. There is this metric that is used, which is called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is measured from 0 to 1. 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, up until 1, right? And the further it moves to the 1, the more unequal society is. So when we took over this country in 1994, the Gini coefficient was 0.54, whatever the case is. 0.7, right? We're sitting with a Gini coefficient of 0.7. So that is how unequal,
so we've grown in the inequality.
We've grown in the inequality. We've got more people, as I'm talking about the pyramid structure that we have. You can see that more and more people are desperate, are unemployed, are living in poverty, are living in very serious adversities. And the only language when people are, I once spoke to a guy, CEO of an organization, he said, we are entering a very dangerous phase and space in a country where we have way too many people who have nothing to lose. And he says, he says, you don't want to be in that environment, because when people don't have anything to lose, then they act without thinking.
Because they've got nothing to lose.
They've got nothing to lose.
And no amount of law enforcing, no amount of anything is going to make them.
It is not going to. No, it doesn't matter what you do.
Yes.
We said that was us as young black people in this country at some point. Where we would go out against R1 rifles with sticks and stones. You knew you could die, you could be paralyzed, but we had nothing to lose. We had nothing to lose. We went out anyway. So 26 years later, into democracy, we are exactly at that point again, where way too many people have nothing to lose. And as I said earlier, if they were to decide to all get angry at once, there is very little that we as a country, we as leaders, we as government, we as business can do to actually restore, the balance.
Yeah, sure.
It's
a really sad state of affairs. I mean, last question, which is directly linked to what you said earlier on around, you're not taking the responsibility away of your organization to make sure that you do the right thing. What can your organization do in its independent state without, relying on the dependencies that it has of other stakeholders? What are the things that you are in control of that you can do to try and improve the business environment in such a way that it's open to other people which are currently excluded?
Business owns capital. Business is the only social partner in this country that has got disproportionate resources. So if business were to be very deliberate and intentional about changing the status quo and moving things towards a particular direction, it can. So business can actually unlock their balance sheets, and choose to invest in this country, and choose to take a chance in this country, and probably maybe ignore everything that economics and business economics and our shareholders tell us that, we speak about a conducive environment within which to operate. But we can choose to ignore the conducive environment and say we are going to take a chance on South Africa. Because when you look at, the attractiveness of South Africa in relation to the continent and in relation to the world, you can see that we've got everything going for us. So there is no reason why, business is not investing. We've got the market, because the interest of South Africa is actually, or the interest in South Africa is not in South Africa in and of itself. 59 million people is not a big enough market, right? You've got Nigeria that is sitting with 150 million people. So the interest in South Africa is in as far as it gives you a gateway to the African continent, where you've got the 1.3 billion people. There are 3 continents in the world that can, boast those numbers. It is the Asia, it is I don't know. So it's China, it's India, and it's Africa. You know, so we are therefore strategically positioned, you know, to can receive investment, because you know that where there is market, because remember, capital will come in an environment where there's two things and two things only, where there is a market and where there is an opportunity to make a profit. Now, is there a market? Of course, we've got the 1.3 billion people. Is there an opportunity to make profits? Of course, there is opportunity. If there is a market, there is an opportunity to make. So I think business should actually take a very unequivocal, you know, decision, you know, to say that we are going to choose to invest in the South African continent. We've got the infrastructure, we've got the justice system, you know, we've got...
And we can pay less for labor, right? As well.
You know, comparatively speaking, I guess, you know, when you look to the West, Western markets, you know, we are relatively there, as it were. But in an environment where business is not on its own making those decisions, what is to be done? And for me, this is why governments in any environment and in any country are important. It is the role of government to force us as social partners to do the right thing. And in the South African context, we have a government that is dismally failing to hold all of us as social partners, you know, accountable. And when we speak about political will, this is what we're talking about. You know, the ability or lack thereof, you know, the interest or lack thereof of government to do the right thing, to drive the country, the economy, the environment in a particular direction so that we can attain the economic prosperity that we are all striving for.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to the hot seat.
Yes,
Cheers.
Thanks. Thank you. Cheers. Thanks.
Wow, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. That was a very, very insightful and interesting conversation we just had with Busisiwe Mavuso, who is the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa. Look, the only thing that each and every one of us needs to do is to really make sure that we do our part as the ordinary South African citizens to ensure that we preserve the resources of this country and whatever's good for South Africa. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are tuning in for the first time, please remember to subscribe, comment and like. And if you're not tuning in for the first time, thank you so much for tuning in again to this show. Really appreciate your support. Thank you. It's been a real thing.